The place where time stands still. The village of Ust-Vyazma in the Smolensk Gubernet was in 1846 little more than a cluster of 47 homesteads pressed against a slow bend in the Vyazma River. In summer, the air was heavy with the scent of flax drying in the yards. In winter, the river froze not with the clean silver ice of other places, but with a dull, opaque skin that trapped pockets of dark water beneath. From the north, dense coniferous forest rolled in waves toward the Vitebsk border. The south was open marshland, hummocks of sedge and reed, with hidden pools deep enough to swallow a cart horse. To the east, beyond a narrow cart road, rose a small hill, long abandoned as a cemetery. The crooked wooden crosses all leaned in the same direction, like heads bent in uneasy prayer. The people of Ust-Vyazma spoke in a hybrid tongue, the consonants of Smolensk speech softened by Belarusian vowels and sprinkled with archaic words that had no meaning a few versts away. Outsiders noticed their reluctance to speak about certain subjects, particularly the stretch of riverbank near the Laptev property. One surviving letter from the parish clerk, F.N. Borisov, dated April 42, gives one of the earliest written impressions of the place. And the water there has a strange stillness. It does not run like other rivers. Sometimes when the sun is low, it appears to move backwards, a most disagreeable sight to behold. The people avert their gaze from it, as if embarrassed. Architecturally, the village was unremarkable. Log-built izbas, roofed with pine shingles or straw, sometimes patched with scraps of tin. The lanes were beaten dirt, turning to ankle-deep mud in spring. Only one structure departed from this sameness, an abandoned brick smithy near the western edge of the settlement, its windows smashed, its forge long cold. No one recalled precisely why it had closed, only that the blacksmith had gone to serve in the army and not returned. In the center stood the Laptev house. Larger than any other dwelling, it was 2 full stories with a small mezzanine above, decorative carved window frames, and a front porch supported by squared oak posts. A tall fence of weathered planks enclosed the yard. The Laptev estate faced the river directly, with its back to the forest. Behind the main house was a barn, a granary, and a smaller, much older structure, described by later witnesses as half-shed, half-storehouse, whose door was always barred. Locals did not visit without invitation. The Laptevs rarely gave such invitations. At gatherings in the tavern, locals sometimes spoke of faint noises, tapping or a slow thudding, heard at night from somewhere near the riverbank, especially when the air was still. Children were told not to fetch water from the Laptev well, though no one could explain precisely why. In his 1845 travel journal, an itinerant trader named P.I. Krasnov recorded a short entry after passing through the area. Ust-Vyazma is a quiet place, but the people's eyes are restless. They look away from you in mid-conversation, as if watching something that you cannot see. There is a grand house there, owned by the Laptev family, of which I heard various tales, none told plainly, always cut short with a change of subject. The climate of Ust-Vyazma was not unlike that of other Smolensk settlements. Long, snowbound winters, muddy springs, warm though brief summers. Yet there was a sense among neighboring villages that the seasons behaved differently here. Old women insisted that frost came earlier in the Laptev fields and lingered longer. that the river thawed last along the bank beneath the Laptev yard. There is one curious note in the records of the district Zemstvo Council, dated November 1839, mentioning an unseasonable ice formation along the Ust-Vyazma stretch of the river. Though no cause was given, the clerk added in the margin, "Fishermen will not go to that water after dusk. Say they hear a knocking under the ice." Such remarks, preserved among routine tax lists and grain tallies, might have been dismissed as superstition had it not been for the events that followed 7 years later, when the name Laptev would begin appearing in official reports of disappearances, unexplained deaths, and the strange contents of a cellar no one had known existed.
The Laptev family. The Laptev name first entered the parish records of Ust-Vyazma in 1798, when Stepan Vasilyevich Laptev, then 36 years old, purchased the riverside parcel that would become the family estate. According to a notarized sale document, still preserved in the Smolensk Regional Archive, the price he paid was less than 1/10 of its assessed value. The seller, one Sergei Yakovlevich Morozov, removed his family to St. Petersburg after an unfortunate occurrence, the nature of which was not specified. From scattered references in neighboring villages, it appears that Stepan came from the Yaroslav governorate and was, at least outwardly, a man of means. Within 2 years of his arrival, he had the 2-story house constructed, a rare luxury for the area, and fenced his property with tall planks that shielded much of the yard from view. By the 1840s, the Laptev household was in the hands of Stepan's only surviving son, Andrei Stepanovich Laptev, then in his early 50s. Contemporary descriptions portray him as a tall, narrow-shouldered man with a noticeable limp in his left leg. He was seldom seen in the village lanes, except on market days, when he would collect supplies with minimal conversation. His wife, Pelageya Ivanovna, was 14 years his junior, originally from a hamlet to the north. Several villagers referred to her, without open malice, as the herb keeper, or the one who knows plants. A notebook found decades later in the ruins of the Laptev barn contained detailed notes on tinctures, poultices, and root preparations in a careful, rounded hand that experts have compared to Pelageya's signature in church registers. The couple had 3 children. Vasilisa, born 1827, a pale young woman with what one witness described as an unblinking way of looking straight through you. Egor, born 1829, taller than his father, often spotted walking alone along the riverbank at dusk. Matrona, born 1834, a lively girl with a fondness for climbing trees, but kept close to the yard by her mother. The Laptev dogs, 2 massive blackguard animals of uncertain breed, were chained to heavy iron rings set into stone near the gate. They barked rarely, but with a deep, chest-vibrating growl that discouraged strangers from lingering. Inside the village, the family maintained a reputation for wealth, but also for isolation. They contributed to church repairs, paid taxes promptly, and hired local laborers for seasonal work, yet avoided public gatherings except for religious holidays. Those who worked for them remarked on the strange quiet of the estate. No idle singing from the women, no hammering from the outbuildings, and the sense that windows were often shuttered from within, even during daylight. One former farmhand, Syomen Petrov, gave a statement in 1850 that was preserved in the district gendarme files. You would not hear much noise in that yard, even when many were working. It was as if all had agreed not to speak more than a few words. Sometimes Mistress Pelageya would send me with baskets towards the shed at the forest edge. She would wait at the path and take them from me herself, not letting me step closer. Rumors circulated that the Laptevs buried none of their kin in the village cemetery. Parish burial registers between 1798 and 1846 list no Laptev interments at all, despite the deaths of Stepan and at least 2 children that had been recorded in birth registers decades earlier. Villagers whispered that the Laptevs had their own way of handling their dead, though no one claimed to have seen a private grave. One tantalizing fragment, found in the personal correspondence of the district priest, Father Yake, hints at more. The Laptevs decline church burial for their departed, citing family custom. They do not refuse prayers, yet they insist on keeping the remains close. I have advised them this is improper, but André only smiles and says it is for the safety of the living. Letter dated March 1844, held in Diocesan Archive, Smolensk. The Laptev children rarely mixed with others their age. Vasilisa, in particular, was said to be skilled in embroidery of an unusually dense pattern, often worked in black or dark green thread. Egor was sometimes spotted walking at night between the house and the shed, carrying an unlit lantern. From the outer world's perspective, the Laptev estate was simply an insular rural household, peculiar in some habits, but not overtly criminal. But within Ust-Vyazma, the combination of unblinking reserve, guarded property, and unexplained family customs had already set them apart, long before the first disappearance in the summer of 1846, an event that would shift the Laptev name from local curiosity to the subject of police reports, whispered accusations, and the enduring legend of the Knocking River.
The first disappearance. The summer of 1846 in Ust-Vyazma was unseasonably dry. The Vyazma River's surface lay low and sluggish, exposing pale roots along the bank. By August, the air carried a faint, persistent smell of algae and mud. On the 11th of that month, the village saw the first in what would later be recognized as a series of disappearances. The missing child was Akulina Zhuravyova, age 11, the middle daughter of a poor flax-combing family. She was last seen carrying a glazed earthenware jug toward the Laptev well, one of the deeper and cleaner water sources in the village, especially in dry years. The elder's ledger shows that at approximately 6:30 in the evening, 2 women, identified as Praskovya Denisova and Varvara Kuznetsova, saw Akulina walking alone, barefoot, along the lane leading to the Laptev gate. According to both, the child was wearing a faded blue sarafan and had her hair in 2 braids. Later that evening, when Akulina failed to return, her mother, Marfa Stepanovna, began asking neighbors.
By midnight, half the village knew the girl was missing. 2 days later, on the 14th of August, the elder, Gavrilo Antonovich, dispatched 2 men, Nikita Shubin and Timofey Rogov, to search the Laptev property. The official note in the Volost report reads, "Barefoot prints observed from the well to the lane and onward to the Laptev fence. From there to the gate. Beyond the gate, no clear prints, the earth trampled by many feet, making discernment impossible." When questioned, Pelageya Lapteva stated calmly that the child had not entered the yard and suggested she may have gone toward the marsh path to gather berries. Andrei Laptev did not speak, merely standing behind his wife with arms crossed. The search extended to the riverbank, marsh, and surrounding woods. No clothing, footprints, or signs of struggle were found. The jug was missing. That night, according to a later statement by Marfa Stepanovna, she awoke near dawn to what she described as thin laughter from the direction of the Laptev barn. It was like the giggling of a girl, but drawn out and far away, as if coming from under the ground. The dogs were quiet. I pulled on my shawl and went out, but when I reached the road, I heard no more. Statement given 1850 to District Investigator G.I. Lebyadev. This account was dismissed at the time as grief-induced fancy. Yet it would be echoed, almost word for word, by 2 other witnesses in later years. The only other contemporaneous description comes from Semyon Petrov, the Laptev's former farmhand, who was delivering firewood to the estate that same evening. "I set down the wood and saw the mistress walking from the shed toward the house, carrying a bundle under her arm, wrapped in what looked like an apron. She was looking at me the whole time, though she kept walking. She passed into the house without speaking." Petrov admitted he told no one at the time, fearing dismissal from his own employment elsewhere. His account only surfaced in the gendarme files after the cellar discovery in 1850. There were murmurs among the villagers that the Laptev well was not like others. Several said the water, when left to stand, developed a faint reddish film on its surface, though no such sample was ever officially examined. One boy, Vanya Obrezkov, later claimed that, as children, they dared each other to lean over the Laptev well at night because sometimes you could hear a knocking from down there, like wood tapping wood. The disappearance of Akulina was reported to the Dorogobuzh district police. 3 days later, a mounted constable, S.A. Kravtsov, arrived and took statements from the elder, Akulina's mother, and the 2 women who last saw her. His closing note was terse. No evidence of abduction. Possible accidental wandering into marsh. Will not pursue unless further proof. With the official search concluded, the case fell back into the realm of village rumor. But a quiet change had taken place. Mothers forbade their children to fetch water from the Laptev well. Men began watching the path near the Laptev barn when returning from the tavern at night. And for the first time in decades, the Laptev family was spoken of openly, not as odd, but as dangerous. It would take less than 3 months for the fear to deepen when another villager, this time a grown woman, walked into the Laptev yard and never returned.
Illness and fear. By late September 1846, the air in Ust-Vyazma had turned damp and chill. Morning fog clung to the river, curling low over the Laptev property before dissolving into the fields. It was during these weeks that another pattern began to emerge, not of missing persons, but of livestock deaths that villagers described as wrong in both manner and aftermath. The first case was reported on September 27th by Dmitry Klugnev, a smallholder whose cows grazed in the meadow bordering the Vyazma River. He found one of his heifers lying dead near the water, legs folded neatly beneath its body, as if it had lain down to sleep. The animal's eyes were open, mouth slack. There was no blood, no evidence of struggle. Over the next 2 weeks, similar losses struck 4 other households, all situated closer to the Laptev estate. The pattern was peculiar. The animals were found in positions of unnatural stillness, sometimes with the grass around them flattened in a circular shape. In 3 instances, small incisions were discovered along the neck, clean and straight, without ragged edges. A report dated October 12, 1846, from District Feldsher P.M. Anisimov to the Dorogobuzh Medical Office records, "The livestock deaths do not suggest contagion. Internal organs, when examined, are pale but intact. Cause of death indeterminate. Bodies remain warm for an unusually long time post-mortem. In one case, over 6 hours. Skin shows localized blanching around the neck." This persistence of warmth disturbed the farmers more than the loss itself. Several refused to butcher the carcasses, insisting there was something unclean about them. The animals were buried in shallow pits, lime sprinkled over the bodies. Rumors tied the deaths to the Laptev family almost immediately. The geography of the cases, each within a short walk of their fence line, fed the suspicion. Yet no one could articulate a clear cause. Andrei Laptev, questioned briefly by the elder, responded only that a fox or other vermin must be to blame. Meanwhile, smaller unease began to creep into everyday life. Several villagers claimed to have seen Egor Laptev, the 17-year-old son, walking along the river at night, sometimes stopping to kneel at the water's edge. One account, given decades later by Ivan Trofimovich Masyuk, described a particular encounter. "I was crossing the meadow after sunset when I saw the Laptev boy by the bank. He was leaning over, both hands in the water, though it was cold as ice. I called to him, but he did not answer. Then he stood up, very slowly, and walked away without looking back." It was also during this autumn that the Laptev's 2 massive black dogs, normally kept on heavy chains, were seen free more often. Witnesses said the dogs roamed the yard silently, not barking at passers-by, but staring fixedly from behind the fence. One evening, a group of boys returning from fishing reported the dogs standing side by side in the open gateway, their eyes catching the last light like glass. By mid-October, the tension had thickened. Families living near the Laptevs began locking their doors at night, an uncommon practice in such a small settlement. At the tavern, conversations about the missing girl, Akulina, merged with talk of the dead cattle. The older men warned the younger not to trespass near the Laptev land. One peculiar entry appears in the parish clerk's notes from October 19th. At Compline, during prayer for the departed, Pelageya Lapteva requested inclusion of a name not known in the parish rolls. When asked for the surname, she replied it was not needed and pressed a silver kopeck into my hand. I refused. Though no one could prove wrongdoing, the string of incidents, the disappearance, the livestock deaths, and the quiet defiance of custom settled in the collective mind as pieces of the same unsettling whole. It was in this atmosphere of whispered occasion and unease that the second disappearance occurred in November 1846. Unlike Akulina's case, this time the missing person was an adult, last seen willingly stepping into the Laptev yard in broad daylight.
The second disappearance. On the morning of November 3rd, 1846, a pale frost lay over the fields, glinting in the low sun. That day, Evdokia Trofimova, aged 22, walked from her small cottage on the western edge of Ust-Vyazma to the Laptev estate. She was known to do laundry and light cleaning for Pelageya Lapteva 2 or 3 times a week. Her husband, Mikhail Trofimonov, had left before dawn to cut wood in the forest, expecting her home by evening. Witnesses later testified that Evdokia passed the tavern just after 8, her hair covered with a red kerchief, carrying a wicker basket with folded linen. Vasilisia Lapteva, the eldest Laptev daughter, was seen at the gate as she approached. The 2 women exchanged a few words before stepping into the yard together. She was never seen leaving. By dusk, Mikhail returned to find the cottage cold and empty. At first he assumed his wife had stayed to finish work and would return after the evening meal. But when darkness settled and the frost began to harden on the window panes, he went to the Laptev gate. Mikhail later told the village elder, "I called, but no one came. The dogs were there, sitting in the yard, not barking. I could see light from one window, but the shutters were closed. I knocked on the gate, nothing. Then one of the dogs stood and walked toward the house, slow, like it was listening to something inside. I left." The next morning, Mikhail went to the elder, Gavrilo Antonovich, who ordered a small search party. They visited the Laptevs just before midday. Pelageya met them at the gate, saying Evdokia had left shortly after washing some things. When asked if she had mentioned where she was going, Pelageya shrugged and said, "Perhaps to the river." The search turned up no sign of her, until 2 boys gathering firewood behind the abandoned smithy spotted a bright scrap of fabric in the dirt. It was Evdokia's kerchief, torn along one edge. A few feet away lay the wicker basket, its handle broken. The ground around the find was soft from a recent thaw, showing marks as if something heavy had been dragged toward the Laptev side of the lane. The official note in the Volosky records, dated November 4th, states, "Fabric identified by M. Trofimonov as belonging to his wife. Signs of dragging toward Laptev property observed. Prints indistinct due to multiple overlying tracks. Dogs heard inside yard during inspection. No response to owners at knocking at gate." 2 days later, Sergeant S.A. Kravtsov, the same officer who had investigated Akulina's disappearance, returned to Ust-Vyazma. This time he insisted on entering the Laptev home. The inspection report, one of the few surviving documents from 1846 relating directly to the Laptev interior, describes sparse but orderly rooms, an abundance of preserved goods in the storeroom, and one particular detail that later gained significance. In the back storeroom, found 3 large clay vessels sealed over with thick wax, surface dusty, contents not examined owing to protest from the mistress of the house, who claimed they contained pickled cabbage. The officer noted no visible blood or signs of struggle. The dogs were confined to the yard during the inspection, but their chains allowed them to reach the gate, where they stood silent, watching the men work. Kravtsov departed without further action, his final remark in the report reading, "Insufficient cause for seizure or arrest. Recommend continued watch if complaints persist." For Mikhail Trofimonov, this was no resolution. In the weeks that followed, he reportedly took to walking the village at night, lingering near the Laptev fence. On one occasion, Nikita Shubin, the same man who had searched for Akulina, claimed to have seen Mikhail standing by the Laptev barn well past midnight, as if listening to something. By the onset of winter, 2 people had vanished in less than 3 months, one a child, one a grown woman, both last known to have been near or within the Laptev property. And yet, with no bodies and no legal cause to press further, the matter stalled. But fear in Ust-Vyazma did not stall. It spread. People began to notice things they had once ignored: unlit windows where light should be, shadows moving in the Laptev yard at hours when no one was expected to be awake, the faint sound of hammering under the cover of wind. It was in this climate of tension that the first official inquiry into the Laptev family would be convened the following winter, an inquiry that, despite its failings, left behind some of the most haunting descriptions of Andrei Laptev ever committed to paper.
The first official inquiry. On January 14, 1847, the district administration in Dorogobuzh formally authorized a Volost-level inquiry into the unresolved disappearances in Ust-Vyazma and surrounding territory. The record is preserved in fragmentary form, some sheets missing, others darkened by damp. But enough remains to reconstruct the outlines of the proceedings. The inquiry was overseen by clerk Ivan Artemyevich Povalyev, a wiry man with precise handwriting who was known for his reluctance to leave his office. Witnesses recalled that he arrived in Ust-Vyazma with a small entourage and stayed at the tavern, shunning the hospitality of local households. The Laptevs were summoned for questioning on January 17th. The session began in the Volost hut, a single-room log structure warmed by a central stove. Outside, snow fell thick and wet, muffling the sound of passing sleds. The transcript, one of the few documents that Povalyev signed personally, reads, Question: Did either of you, on the days of September 3rd and November 3rd, see or speak with the missing persons, Akulina Ilyinichna and Yevdokia Trofimova? Answer: We have said before, the child passed our fence, we saw her, and then she was gone down the lane. We did not speak to her. The woman came for washing, stayed some hours, and left toward the river. Question: Did you observe them in distress or accompanied by strangers? Answer: No distress, no strangers. Povalyev's notes in the margin are terse. Both calm, no contradiction in statement. Male speaks little, avoids eye contact. Female composed but presses lips tightly when not speaking.
several neighbors testified that they had seen Yevdokia enter the Laptev yard on November 3rd, but could not confirm her departure. When asked about the torn kerchief and basket found near the smithy, Andrei Laptev claimed ignorance. "There are always rags in the lane. The wind blows them. Baskets break." One detail in the testimonies caught Povalyev's attention. 3 separate witnesses mentioned hearing a heavy knocking as of boards being nailed from the Laptev property late at night in the weeks following each disappearance. When pressed, Andrei responded that he had been mending the barn roof and repairing the root cellar doors. Despite winter being an unlikely season for such tasks. The inquiry also revisited Sergeant Kravtsov's earlier inspection, particularly the 3 large clay vessels sealed with wax. At Povalyev's request, these were brought into the Volost hut for examination on January 19th. The wax was chipped away and the lids pried open. The smell that escaped was described in the record as pungent with sourness. The first vessel did indeed contain pickled cabbage, the second, cucumbers. The third, here the writing falters, the ink smudged, held a dark mass in brine, fibrous, not vegetable. No further description appears. The vessel was resealed and returned to the Laptevs on the same day. Later oral accounts from villagers insist that the third vessel contained animal flesh, but not like any pork or beef they had seen. One claimed to have glimpsed a small hand, white as lard, before the lid went back on. No such note appears in the official file. The inquiry closed on January 23rd. Citing insufficient evidence for further action. The final paragraph in Povalyev's summation reads, "Without bodies or direct witness, matter remains unproven. Advise observation of the Laptev household and record of any future complaints." When the clerk and his men left Ust-Vyazma, the snow had deepened to thigh height, and travel between households became rare. The Laptevs remained in their home, seemingly untouched by the accusations. Yet, in the weeks that followed, villagers began to speak of new noises, not the hammerings of before, but a faint scraping, as if something were being dragged over the earthen floor beneath the house. Some said they heard it even when walking past the property on the road. Others claimed to see thin smoke rising from the Laptev chimney on windless nights, the smell acrid, almost metallic. These small, persistent details, impossible to prove, easy to doubt, did more to cement the Laptevs' reputation than any formal inquiry. And they set the stage for the event in spring 1847 that would finally draw outsiders back into the village, this time for reasons far darker than missing persons.
The Spring Flood Discovery. The winter of 1846 to 47 was among the harshest in memory. By February, the Drisa River lay under a sheath of ice nearly half an arshin thick, and the snow along its banks had risen higher than a man's chest. When the thaw came in late March, it came suddenly. Days of relentless southern wind and warm rain turned the snowpack into torrents of brown water, flooding low-lying fields and bursting through the river ice in jagged slabs. On the morning of March 29, 1847, the village awoke to a roar from the river bend near the Laptev property. The old drainage ditch that cut along their eastern fence had swollen into a rushing channel. Several villagers gathered to watch as the current tore at the bank, carrying away clumps of sod, fence posts, and debris. It was Pavel Yegorov, a carpenter, who noticed something wedged in a tangle of roots along the eroded bank. He waded in up to his knees to free it, at first thinking it was a drowned goat. But when he heaved it onto the grass, the crowd fell silent. It was a burlap sack, the weave swollen and blackened from long submersion. The cord binding its neck had loosened, and as Pavel shifted it, the sack's contents spilled partly into view. A small arm, pale and waterlogged, the skin almost translucent. Pavel staggered back. The others stood frozen. Then Matrena Vasilyevna, the midwife, knelt and drew the arm further into the light. She would later testify. It was a child, small, perhaps 6, the hair light, tangled in threads from the sack. The skin had no blood in it. The eyes, I did not look long. We pulled the sack closed again and sent for the elder. By midday, the Volost elder, Gavrilo Antonovich, arrived, accompanied by 2 men to bear the sack to the tavern cellar, the only cool, enclosed space available. Word spread quickly. Some villagers crossed themselves as they passed the Laptev fence. A second discovery followed within hours. The swollen ditch had carved deeper into the soil beneath the Laptev boundary. Near where the ditch turned sharply toward the river, a second sack became visible, its top protruding from the mud. Unlike the first, this one was weighted with a rusted iron chain looped twice around the burlap. When hauled out, the sack gave off a smell so pungent that several onlookers gagged. Inside were bones, mostly small, mixed with something like coarse ash. No flesh remained, but fragments of cloth were found, one identified by Mikhail Trofimov as similar to his wife's work apron. The official notation in the Dorogobuzh District Incident Register, dated March 30, 1847, reads, 2 sacks recovered from flood channel east of Laptev homestead, first containing mortal remains of 1 minor, identity unknown, second containing partial remains, possibly adult female, condition advanced decomposition. Chain of second sack indicates deliberate submersion. Both sacks of same weave and make, comparable to those observed in Laptev's storehouse during prior visit, November 4, 1846. That same day, Sergeant S.A. Kravtsov returned to the village under orders to detain Andrei and Pelageya Lapteva for questioning in Dorogobuzh. According to later court testimony, the arrest did not go as planned. When Kravtsov and his men arrived at the Laptev house, the gate was ajar. The dogs were gone. Inside, the rooms were cold. No fire in the stove. A loaf of bread, half sliced, sat on the table, the knife still embedded. Pelageya's shawl hung from its usual peg, but there was no sign of the Laptevs. Searches of the house over the next 2 days yielded a discovery that would become one of the most whispered about details in Ust-Vyazma folklore. A trap door in the root cellar, concealed beneath stacked barrels. The door opened onto a low tunnel shored with rough planks, leading toward the river.
Floodwater had already begun to seep in, and part of the tunnel had collapsed. No tracks were visible. The Laptevs had vanished as completely as their victims. Over the following week, the swollen Drisa receded, leaving debris tangled in the reeds. Among it, villagers found small scraps of cloth, bits of wax-coated paper, and a single boot believed to belong to Andrei. None of these finds were conclusive. By April, the case files for the Laptev disappearances grew to over 30 folios, yet the central fact remained. The two prime suspects had escaped, leaving behind the first undeniable proof that something terrible had happened within the bounds of their land.
The tunnel and the ledger. The collapse of the tunnel discovered beneath the Laptev root cellar did not deter the Dorogobuzh authorities. On April 4, 1847, a team of 6 men returned, armed with spades, lanterns, and lengths of rope. Their orders were clear: excavate what could be reached before spring flooding destroyed any remaining evidence. The tunnel opening measured 28 vershoks, or approximately 1.25 feet, wide, and descended at a shallow angle before curving east toward the Drisa. The planks shoring the walls were rough-sawn pine, sap still visible on some edges, suggesting recent work. The first 10 arshins, about 23 feet, were passable, though the air was heavy and damp. Beyond that, the roof had collapsed entirely, the soil saturated and smelling faintly of rot. One of the diggers, Fyodor Stepanovich, later recounted in a sworn statement. The earth was black and soft, as if mixed with ash. In places, we saw small white pieces which, when struck with the spade, made a dry sound. We thought them to be stones, but when the clerk looked, he said they were bits of bone, some no larger than a finger joint. Unable to proceed further, the men shifted focus to the Laptev house itself. The single-room dwelling had been largely undisturbed since the couple's disappearance. Beneath the sleeping platform, they found a locked chest of birchwood, reinforced with iron straps. The lock had been crudely broken, perhaps in haste by the Laptevs themselves before flight, but the lid still stuck fast until pried with an axe handle. Inside lay an assortment of mundane and unsettling objects. Several bundles of coarse linen, some stained dark in patches. 2 small leather pouches containing human teeth, 28 in total, many with roots intact. A child's wooden toy horse, its surface worn smooth. A bound ledger book, the cover plain but water-spotted. It was this ledger that most perplexed investigators. The pages, written in a tight, slanted hand, contained rows of names, dates, and brief notations. The earliest entry was May 12, 1838, the latest October 29, 1846. Some names were known to the villagers, people who had moved away, died of illness, or simply ceased to appear in public. Others were strangers, perhaps transients or travelers. Many entries bore a small mark beside the name, a cross, a circle, or, in several cases, what looked like a crudely drawn fish. Next to certain names was a single number, always between 3 and 9. No explanation was provided. An excerpt from the ledger. 3rd June, 1842. Petrov, Y. Fish, 4. 17 September, 1843. Girl from Smolensk Road, Circle, 5. 4th November, 1846. E. Trofimova, Cross, 7. Sergeant Kravtsov, in his report to the Dorogobuzh district office dated April 9, 1847, wrote, "I believe the ledger is a record of their acts. Whether the numbers signify sums of money, weights, or other quantities, I cannot yet determine. The marks may correspond to method or origin. Urgent advice: preserve this book in secure keeping, as it is the only document that may prove intent and premeditation." In the Laptev loft, investigators found 3 wax-coated cloth parcels, each containing a thick paste of salt, herbs, and what appeared to be dried animal fat. When warmed by the lantern heat, the parcels emitted a sweet, sickly odor. Samples were sent to Dorogobuzh for examination, but the results, if ever completed, are not preserved in the surviving file. Rumors began almost immediately. Some villagers claimed the ledger was a menu, each number the count of meals taken from a victim. Others whispered of an old sect in the Vyazma forests that ate for remembrance, believing the soul could be preserved through the body. No official document supports this, but the association stuck, and the name The Rememberers began appearing in later folk retellings. The ledger, teeth, and parcels were packed into a sealed crate and transported to the district office on April 11. 2 guards accompanied the cart. By the time it arrived, one of the parcels was missing, the wax cloth gone without trace. The guards swore they had not opened the crate. Within weeks, the Laptev homestead was abandoned to the elements. The spring rains rotted the fence, and the tunnel entrance caved in completely. By early summer, weeds grew waist-high around the house, and children dared each other to touch its door before running back to the safety of the lane. The case now had physical evidence, a written record, and human remains, but no living suspects. And as Episode 9 will show, the disappearance of the Laptevs was far from the end. In fact, the next stage would take the horror far beyond Ust-Vyazma's borders.
The Disappearance Trail. By late April 1847, the Dorogobuzh authorities realized that Andrei and Pelagia Laptev had vanished without a trace. Unlike their victims, whose remains were increasingly surfacing along the Drisa, the Laptevs seemed to have left Ust-Vyazma entirely. Yet traces of their passage appeared in ways that unsettled investigators. The first external report came from the village of Baljaya Gorka, approximately 5 versts northeast of Ust-Vyazma. On April 21, a merchant named Ivan Pavlovich Smirnov submitted a formal statement. On the morning of April 20th, a man and woman, thin and dressed in dark coats, arrived at the tavern. They asked for lodging and food, but gave no names. They were polite, though I noticed their eyes darted to every window and door. In the morning, they were gone, leaving behind a bundle of cloth and a small carved box containing several teeth, some yellowed, some broken. The description matched the Laptevs almost exactly. Thin build, pale complexion, dark clothing, and peculiar attention to surveillance. Smirnov's tavern ledger confirms the date, noting guests departed early, bundle remains, paid in coins, exact sum uncertain. Simultaneously, rumors surfaced in Chertanova, further along the Smolensk road. Villagers reported seeing a man and woman near the woods, often at dusk,
carrying burlap sacks. Witness Matvey Orlov testified in later interviews. They moved quietly, almost sliding across the path. I saw the woman drop something into a hollow tree. I dared not look closely, but it glinted white in the fading light, like bone. They did not speak, and when I called, they vanished into the forest. My horse reared. I fell. When I looked back, the path was empty. The trail, though sparse, suggested purpose. The Laptevs were not simply fleeing. They were transporting items, bundles, boxes, perhaps remains, in a methodical, deliberate manner. Investigators at Dorogobuzh began assembling a map of sightings, connecting small villages and outlying forests, and noting consistent patterns. Travel only by night or early morning. Avoiding main roads, preferring wooded paths or riverbanks. Leaving behind small caches of objects, often with human teeth or cloth remnants. On April 28, a more disturbing report reached the authorities from the hamlet of Sukhaya Lipa, near the confluence of the Vyazma and Drisa tributaries. A local miller, Grigory Timofeyev, discovered a shallow pit partially covered with straw and clay. Within it lay a small pile of bones, mostly for children, mixed with fragments of coarse linen and an iron chain, strikingly similar to those found at the Laptev homestead. Timofeyev wrote in his statement, "I did not dare to remove the bones myself. I covered them lightly with soil and sent for the priest. When the men arrived from Dorogobuzh, the pit had collapsed, as if the earth itself had swallowed it." This pattern of partial recoveries and sudden disappearances frustrated investigators. Attempts to track the Laptevs directly failed. Even local peasants who might have recognized them hesitated to speak, citing superstition or fear. The ledger discovered earlier, once central, now felt cryptic in a new way. Perhaps it wasn't simply a record, but a guide for moving and hiding items, each mark corresponding to a village or cache. By May 3rd, the Dorogobuzh police dispatched a special contingent to pursue the Laptevs along the Smolensk route. Their orders emphasized stealth and observation, rather than confrontation. Over 10 nights, the contingent patrolled the forests and river paths, but found only evidence of prior passage: flattened grass, half-buried bundles, and a single boot with an iron buckle matching one described in the flood recoveries. No living trace of the couple emerged. Meanwhile, villagers along the route began telling stories that blurred the line between observation and imagination. Some reported hearing the Laptevs' voices calling in the woods, yet when investigators arrived, the sounds ceased. Others swore they glimpsed figures moving between trees at unnatural speed, or saw a shadow that seemed to vanish behind solid trunks. Local folklore quickly labeled these accounts Laptev whispers, though no official report could substantiate them. The cumulative effect was both practical and psychological. While police and merchants tracked footprints, teeth, and small caches, the villagers began associating the Laptevs with an unseen presence, something almost spectral, yet horrifyingly corporeal. By mid-May, the pursuit had stalled. The trail grew cold as the Laptevs moved further from Ust-Vyazma, but the objects they left behind, teeth, cloth, small bones, iron chains, continued to appear unpredictably along rivers, forest edges, and abandoned homesteads.
Dorogobuzh authorities concluded that the Laptevs had either perished in transit or disappeared into the broader Smolensk countryside, leaving a legacy of dread and mystery. As Episode X will reveal, it was not only the Laptevs' trail that haunted the region. An unexpected witness would emerge, providing a key to the ledger and hinting at motives and practices that had so far eluded explanation.
The Confession of the Witness. By June 1847, the Dorogobuzh authorities faced increasing pressure to resolve the Laptev case. The trail had gone cold, yet items continued to surface. Bundles of cloth, human teeth, and small bone fragments along riverbanks and forest paths. Public fear intensified. Villagers refused to travel alone after dusk. Children were kept from the woods entirely. It was during this climate of anxiety that Mikhail Fedorovich Kuznetsov, a 57-year-old itinerant tanner, came forward. He claimed knowledge of the Laptev practices, providing the first direct human testimony linking the ledger to the objects discovered. Kuznetsov had no formal connection to the couple, though he admitted trading leather and tools with them in Ust-Vyazma in the early 1840s. In his sworn statement, dated June 11, 1847, Kuznetsov explained, "I did not witness the acts themselves, but I knew of them. They showed me pieces of bone and told me these were kept for remembering. I asked why. Pelageya said, 'So we do not forget, and so the forest remembers them too.' I did not understand then, and I cannot fully now. But they kept careful notes, numbers, marks, and names. They said it was for order, for balance." Kuznetsov also confirmed the ledger's cryptic symbols. According to him, the cross marked a person taken by illness or natural causes. The circle indicated an intentional removal, typically from a village or roadside. The fish symbol, he claimed in a whispered tone, referred to an exchange, either barter or consumption, though he avoided explicit elaboration. Investigators were struck by the meticulous detail. Kuznetsov described the Laptevs' methods with chilling precision. Bundles were prepared, salted, and wrapped. Teeth and small bones were cleaned in the river before drying in the loft. Each item had a place and a record. They said it must be exact, or the forest would notice. I believed them mad, yet careful. Kuznetsov's testimony helped explain previously baffling phenomena. The irregular appearances of bundles, the selective placement of bones, and even the presence of human teeth in wax-coated parcels could now be interpreted as deliberate, ritualized activity rather than random mischief or murder alone. Yet the witness's account raised new questions. Why did the Laptevs act with such secrecy and precision? What exactly did "the forest would notice" mean? Kuznetsov could offer only speculation. They spoke of voices in the trees, whispering when a number was wrong. I thought it superstition, yet they trembled when they mentioned it. I left them for fear, and for that reason I know no more than I have told. Investigators attempted to trace Kuznetsov's claim about specific caches along the Drissa. On June 14th, a search party unearthed a partially buried bundle near the confluence of two tributaries. Inside were 5 small, carefully wrapped bone fragments and 3 human teeth. The fragments matched those described by Smirnov and Timofeyev. No names or identifiers were present, but the method of preservation confirmed Kuznetsov's statements. Salt, herbs, wax-coated cloth. The confession also offered a potential explanation for the Laptevs' disappearance. They had deliberately planned to vanish, leaving a trail that would confound pursuers. Kuznetsov testified. They spoke of moving north, along the smaller rivers, to a place no one would seek. They said they were guided by the ledger, and that one day, if found, it would show the pattern. They smiled when they said it. The ledger, in this context, became more than a record. It was a map, a ritual guide, and a ledger of survival. Yet even with this revelation, authorities could not track the Laptevs beyond Ust-Vyazma's hinterlands. The couple's movements remained largely speculative, leaving investigators dependent on fragmentary evidence and witness memory. Local folklore began incorporating Kuznetsov's testimony. By late 1847, stories of the Laptev ledger spread across Vyazma's villages. Farmers claimed to see bundles moving on their own along riverbanks, hear whispers among the trees, or glimpse shadowy figures at dusk carrying small sacks. Though unverifiable, these accounts reinforced the aura of dread surrounding the Laptev legacy. Ultimately, the witness provided clarity and confirmed that the Laptevs' practices were deliberate and ritualized, yet he deepened the mystery. Even officials acknowledged that, despite their expertise, some aspects of the case, the meaning of the symbols, the precise mechanics of the ritual, and the fate of the Laptevs themselves might never be understood. As Episode 11 will explore, the next stage would involve a final search in the northern forests, uncovering a location whose chilling contents could only hint at the full extent of the Laptev's secret.
The Northern Hideaway. By July 1847, Dorogobuzh authorities, frustrated by the cold trail and emboldened by Kuznetsov's testimony, organized a full-scale northern search. The target was the dense forests along the upper tributaries of the Drissa River, roughly 30 versts north of Ust-Vyazma, a region seldom traversed due to boggy terrain and sudden river floods. Maps of the area described marshes that swallow horses and men alike, and villagers warned that the Laptevs would have chosen only the most inaccessible spots. The expedition included Inspector Alexei Petrovich Morozov, 2 constables, and Kuznetsov as a guide. Local peasants provided a raft and provisions, warning that the forest seemed older than men and that the wind itself carried whispers. Morozov documented the mission meticulously, in a journal later recovered from Dorogobuzh archives. July 9. Entered the northern forest at first light. Fog lay low upon the marshes, visibility no more than 30 paces. Kuznetsov moved silently, pointing out hollows where he claimed the Laptevs buried bundles.
The air smelled damp, of decaying leaves and wet earth, with a faint sweet odor, strange, like resin mixed with iron. After 2 days of careful searching, they found the first significant cache. Buried beneath a clump of older trees was a hollowed-out stump, its interior lined with waxed linen. Inside were 7 sets of human teeth, some filed or broken deliberately. Small bone fragments, mostly juvenile, carefully wrapped and bound with hemp twine. A small wooden box, blackened by smoke, and containing a few coins from the early 19th century, and a folded scrap of parchment. The parchment contained symbols identical to those in the ledger, crosses, circles, and fish-like marks. Morozov copied the symbols meticulously. Cross over circle, fish beneath cross. Perhaps a date or designation, though I cannot yet interpret it. Kuznetsov trembled when he saw it, muttering, "They kept to the pattern, always the pattern." The following day, the party discovered a hidden structure, partially sunk into the marsh, a small, 1-story timber building, its walls blackened by smoke and decay. Inside, the floor was covered with charred remains of small fires and traces of ashes that smelled faintly of resin. Against one wall was a lofted platform, now collapsed, but beneath it were remnants of bundles similar to those previously recovered. Morozov recorded the sensory details with particular care. The air was thick with must and rot. Every step stirred a fine layer of dust and ash. The walls were warped, nails protruded at odd angles. We found a small, crude carving of 2 figures embracing, carved into a beam. Likely Pelageya and Andrei, if Kuznetsov is to be trusted. It was unsettling, intimate in a place of such horror. While examining the loft, the team discovered the most disturbing evidence yet. A partially buried human skeleton, remarkably intact, with one arm missing. Teeth were filed in patterns that matched the symbols in the ledger. Kuznetsov shivered and refused to approach closer. Morozov noted, "The skeleton appeared arranged, not thrown. Bones separated in sections, some wrapped, some exposed. This was not mere concealment, it was ritual. We could not recover all remains without destroying the fragile structure, and I ordered only partial removal." The northern hideaway confirmed multiple elements of the Laptev's methodology. Ritualistic collection, careful documentation, and the deliberate selection of remote locations to store or process human remains. Yet even here, no trace of Andrei or Pelageya was found. The discovery sent ripples through Dorogobuzh and surrounding villages. Newspapers reported vaguely on hidden northern dens, but officials withheld details to avoid panic. Local legend expanded. Travelers claimed to hear footsteps in the marsh at twilight, whispering voices in the reeds, and glimpses of shadowy figures disappearing into the trees. The northern hideaway concluded in late July, leaving behind partially recovered bundles, documented symbols, and the blackened timber hideaway. Authorities feared returning, citing superstitious dread among peasants and the risk of disease from the marshes. Yet the expedition's records, combined with Kuznetsov's testimony, finally provided a coherent, if horrifying, narrative of the Laptev's operations. Morozov's journal ended with a reflection. It is evident they were methodical, calculating, and yet beyond reason in their devotion to something. What guided them, I cannot say. The ledger, the bundles, the bones, all speak of intent, yet hint at forces unseen. And still, the couple themselves remain absent. One wonders if they ever left, or if the forest kept them, as it once kept the dead. The northern hideaway became the final geographic confirmation of the Laptev Trail, establishing the ritualized and systematic nature of their acts. However, the question of their fate, their motives, and the true meaning of the ledger remained unresolved, setting the stage for the final episodes exploring aftermath, legend, and unanswered mysteries.
The Hidden Ledger. By August 1847, the Dorogobuzh authorities had returned from the northern forests with partial evidence: bundles, bones, and the charred hideaway. Yet the most significant discovery had gone unnoticed in the field: a small iron-bound chest buried beneath the loft of the timber structure. The chest, discovered during a later inventory of recovered materials, contained the Laptev's ledger, preserved remarkably well despite the damp conditions. The ledger was composed of handmade paper, stitched with hemp cord, measuring approximately 25 by 18 centimeters. Each page bore a dense grid of symbols, names, and dates, alongside small marginal sketches, trees, animals, and geometric marks. No conventional language was used, though some pages included rudimentary Russian notes, mostly personal reflections or reminders. Inspector Morozov and Kuznetsov examined the ledger in early September. Morozov recorded his observations. Pages emit the faint odor of resin and salt. Symbols arranged in vertical columns, many cross-referenced. Some entries dated back as far as 1828. I am convinced this is the cumulative record of their practices, not merely a journal, but an operational manual of sorts. Among the entries were repeated references to specific ritual cycles, often coinciding with lunar phases. Certain pages contained diagrams suggesting bundles should be buried in particular orientation relative to the river or forest, reinforcing Kuznetsov's earlier claims that the Laptevs believed the forest itself watched and judged the correctness of their actions. One passage, written in Pelagia's hand, read, "If the tally is off by one, the trees will whisper and the river will weep. Balance must be kept. Andrei knows, and so must I. The ledger remembers." The ledger also contained records of specific individuals with accompanying symbols indicating the method of removal or treatment. Morozov carefully noted, "Cross indicates natural death. Circle taken deliberately. Fish uncertain." Yet the patterns suggest foresight, meticulous planning. It is terrifying in its order and deeply human in its calculation. The ledger allowed investigators to map the Laptev's activities over 2 decades, linking bundles found along the Drissa and its tributaries. Partial correlations were established between dates, local disappearances, and items recovered in the field. However, many entries referred to locations yet discovered, deepening the mystery.
Kuznetsov, visibly shaken, admitted, "I thought I had known them. I had no idea they kept all this. It is more than any man should know. I leave it to God now." Attempts to fully decode the ledger were hindered by its cryptic notation and symbolic system. Morozov wrote to the Dorogobuzh magistrate, "Despite careful study, I cannot claim to understand its entirety. The ledger reveals method, intent, and organization, yet certain passages hint at forces or beliefs beyond reason. It is as though the couple documented not just acts, but a relationship with the forest itself, and perhaps with something unseen." The ledger was later moved to the Dorogobuzh archives, sealed with official oversight. Attempts to reproduce or interpret it widely failed. Scholars and clerks alike reported uneasy sensations, including cold drafts, faint whispers, or inexplicable tremors near the document. Rumors circulated that those who lingered too long with the ledger experienced nightmares of walking forests and counting bones. Locals, meanwhile, incorporated the ledger into folklore. Stories arose of the forest's memory, a concept traced directly to the Laptev's cryptic warnings. Villagers spoke of seeing symbols carved into tree bark near river bends, of bundles mysteriously appearing along footpaths, and of whispers guiding the unwary away from or toward hidden caches. The ledger thus served as both historical evidence and the genesis of enduring myth. It documented acts of extreme secrecy, careful planning, and ritualistic devotion. Yet it never explained fully why the Laptevs committed these acts, leaving both investigators and the public unsettled. Morozov concluded his report in late 1847 with a rare admission of uncertainty. "I have seen the ledger, traced the caches, recovered bones, and heard witnesses. Yet I cannot claim comprehension of their motives nor the ultimate fate of Andrei and Pelagia. Some patterns are evident, others may belong only to the forest or to the minds of those who dwell beyond it." The ledger, hidden yet tangible, ensured the Laptevs' presence persisted in both official record and collective memory. It became the final key to understanding the scope of their activities, though the full truth remained tantalizingly out of reach, leaving room for legend, fear, and the whispered tales of those who dared tread the Drissa's northern forests.
The return of fear. By the early 1880s, Dorogobuzh had changed. Steam-powered mills appeared along the Drissa, and the once isolated northern forests were gradually charted. Yet the Laptev's legend endured. Farmers spoke of strange occurrences near the old hideaways, and local magistrates recorded complaints of missing livestock, sudden chills, and unexplained sounds in the woods. One of the earliest reports came from a peasant named Mikhail Ivanovich Sokolov, whose diary entry from March 12, 1883, survives in the Dorogobuzh archives. "The cows would not enter the northern clearing. I heard whispering voices among the reeds. It seemed to count as I walked past. When I called to them, the voices stopped. I felt eyes upon me. Old Kuznetsov's warnings came to mind. The forest remembers." Though the Laptevs had long disappeared, their methodical approach and cryptic symbols seemed to persist. Farmers discovered small caches of animal bones and coins, sometimes accompanied by symbols resembling those in the ledger. Local clergy attempted blessings and prayers, but villagers reported that the balance the Laptev sought remained intact. Bundles left untouched unless intentionally disturbed. In April 1884, a group of itinerant scholars, led by Professor Dmitry Alexeyevich Voronin, intrigued by rumors of ritualistic activity, visited the Drisa region. Voronin's notes describe an encounter near the original northern hideaway. The forest seemed alive. Every clearing presented the illusion of symmetry, stones arranged, stumps hollowed, branches aligned. One could almost believe some unseen hand had rehearsed the landscape. At dusk, a faint metallic chime sounded, though no bell was present. The air was pungent with resin and decay. I cannot account for the sensation of being observed. Voronin's team attempted to catalogue symbols resembling those in the Laptev's ledger. They found etchings on trees, buried beneath moss, and arrangements of rocks forming circles, triangles, and other geometric patterns. Their notes indicate a recurring motif. The forest itself was treated as a living ledger, with placement, orientation, and arrangement mirroring the symbolic order of the original documents. By 1887, police records show renewed interest. Authorities were called to investigate the disappearance of 3 children near the Drisa's northern tributaries. Witnesses claimed, "They ran toward the reeds, laughing, but the reeds swallowed them. We called, but the wind carried no answer. Only shadows remained." Despite extensive searches, the children were never recovered. Investigators noted disturbed soil, small footprints leading into bogs, and faint impressions of bundles reminiscent of the Laptev's methods decades earlier. These findings revived both fear and curiosity, blending the historical record with emergent folklore. By this time, villagers spoke openly of the counting forest, a term drawn from both Voronin's observations and Kuznetsov's earlier warnings. It was believed that the forest retained memory of the Laptev's acts, and that anyone entering without respect for the hidden order risked disappearance. This belief persisted despite modern interventions, bridges, patrols, and logging, suggesting that the fear was psychologically anchored as much as physically real. The return of fear culminated in the 1892 Chronicle of Dorogobuzh, a local compilation of folklore and police reports. The chronicler, Father Nikolai Petrov, wrote, "Though the Laptevs have long vanished, their shadow remains in every marsh, every reed, every hollowed stump. Those who ignore their presence find the forest unwelcoming. One cannot help but wonder if Andrei and Pelagia were ever mortal, or merely instruments through which the land kept its account." By the late 1890s, the Laptev's acts had transitioned from criminal case to cultural memory, preserved in diaries, newspapers, and scholarly notes. Yet, even as decades passed, the lingering unease suggested an unresolved element, a fear that the forest itself, perhaps guided by the Laptev's meticulous practices, could continue its work independently. The episode closes on a chilling reflection by Voronin. "We documented, sketched, and catalogued, but yet night fell, the forest seemed to breathe. The symbols glimmered faintly in the moonlight, and I could not shake the sensation that we were being tallied. Perhaps the ledger is not merely paper and ink, but something far older, embedded in the trees, the soil, the marsh itself."
Episode 13 leaves viewers with a sense of persistent dread. Though the Laptevs themselves were gone, the northern forests retained their mysteries, continuing to blur the line between historical atrocity and lingering supernatural imprint.
Aftermath and legend. By the early 20th century, Dorogobuzh had undergone significant transformation. Steam engines, railways, and the expansion of logging dramatically reshaped the northern forests once patrolled by the Laptevs. Yet despite these changes, the echoes of their deeds persisted, captured in local memory, police archives, and scattered artifacts from the original caches. The Laptev's ledger, preserved under strict archival supervision, became the focal point for both scholars and folklorists. By 1912, several attempts were made to transcribe and interpret its cryptic symbols. Archival notes from Clark Ivan Murov, who worked on the ledger that year, read, "Some symbols correspond to dates and names. Others appear to indicate spatial arrangements in the forest. I fear that human understanding alone is insufficient to comprehend the totality of what is recorded here. One feels that the forest itself might interpret what we cannot." Even decades later, scholars noted the same unsettling physical reactions reported in the 1840s: chills, disorientation, and auditory hallucinations. Murov's colleague, Professor Eliana Voronina, recorded in 1913, "I lingered over the ledger for more than an hour. The air grew colder, and I felt, with increasing certainty, that something unseen was observing my work. I can neither explain nor dismiss it. Whether superstition or reality, the effect is undeniable." The Dorogobuzh magistrate, mindful of both the ledger's historical value and the public fear it inspired, decreed that public access be prohibited, cementing the Laptev story as a tale of both recorded fact and unsolvable mystery. Meanwhile, the local folklore flourished. Villagers, logging crews, and hunters recounted encounters with the counting forest. Some reported hearing whispering voices near river bends, while others claimed to find carefully arranged stones or bones in unlikely locations. A diary entry from 1921 by peasant Anna Kuznetsova reads, "We passed the northern clearing, and the wind carried whispers, soft, counting, in a voice that was neither male nor female. Father warned us never to disturb the earth there. I do not know what we would find if we did." These stories blurred the line between historical record and supernatural legend. Even as industrialization advanced, the forest maintained its reputation for mystery, with the Laptev's practices, meticulous, ritualistic, and terrifyingly deliberate, casting a shadow over generations. A final chilling testament comes from journalist Boris Lebediev, who visited Dorogobuzh in 1935 to document the Laptev's history. "I sought evidence, but what I found was largely the memory of fear, etched in trees, whispered in marshes, and carried in the cautionary tales of villagers. The ledger exists, the artifacts exist, but the sense of being counted by unseen eyes persists. The Laptevs may have vanished, but their influence remains, as if the forest itself continues their work." Despite the passage of time, investigators and historians acknowledge that certain aspects will never be understood. The ledger's cryptic notations, the recurring forest symbols, and the patterns of disappearances suggest a systematic order that transcends conventional comprehension. The mystery of Andrei and Pelageya Laptev remains unsolved. Did they act out of devotion, superstition, cruelty, or something else entirely? Modern scholars refer to the phenomenon as the Laptev effect, the interplay between human ritual, psychological impact, and persistent environmental anomalies. It is cited in anthropological and folkloric studies of ritualized crime and memory. Yet no definitive explanation exists, leaving room for speculation and dread. By the mid-20th century, Dorogobuzh had absorbed the Laptev story into its identity. Local tours, whispered tales, and academic citations ensured that their deeds were neither forgotten nor fully understood. Visitors to the northern forests were warned. Do not disturb the balance. The forest remembers. In the end, the Laptev's legacy is twofold: historically documented atrocities recorded in police reports, diaries, and the ledger, and an enduring folklore that sustains fear, fascination, and uncertainty. The forest, the ledger, and the unexplained phenomena remain, a testament to a family whose meticulous secrecy blurred the boundary between human atrocity and something that hints at the supernatural. Episode concludes the series with an uneasy certainty. The Laptevs are gone, yet their influence persists. The forest is silent, but vigilant. The ledger is closed, but its memory endures. And Dorogobuzh, its northern forests, and the whispers along the Drissa carry the weight of a history that is both real and unexplainable.